Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Keith Miller. I am the curator of the Gallatin Galleries and the co-host of this event. I want to introduce briefly what's happening in here, but before we start, I'd like to recognize the people who make it possible, because I know it seems like Zoom events should be easier, but they're actually very difficult behind the scenes. So I want to recognize the events team, which is Rachel Plutzer, Teresa Anderson, and Mike West, and the people behind the scenes making this event happen, which is Jen Burge. So if everything goes right, that's because of Jen. And the gallery team, who have done a good job of tweeting and all the other things: August, Carolina, Lily, Lux, and Rachel. And I want to thank all the panelists for coming, and especially Lauren Walsh, who worked very hard to put this together. Before I hand it over to Lauren, I want to make an acknowledgement that the Gallatin Galleries is located on the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape, called Lenapehoking. Lenape people lived in this territory in harmony for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed, but some also remain among the historical tribal communities of the region. We acknowledge the Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. And we affirm the aspiration of the Lenape chief Tamanend that there may be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants of this land. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Lauren Walsh. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Hi, thank you, Keith, for the welcome. Thank you, Gallatin Galleries, for hosting this. I also want to welcome everyone tonight. Thanks for doing yet another Zoom event, one that I think is particularly important given that we're 13 days away from Election Day. So I'm going to say a few words by way of contextualizing tonight's panel discussion, and then we'll dive in. I'll be moderating. I'm a professor at NYU Gallatin. We are, just to put this in context, approaching potentially the most significant presidential election in memory. The outcome will impact our lives in many ways for years and years to come. And so, of course, it's crucial that the public be informed as they head in to cast their vote, informed about politics and policies, informed about social matters, informed about the campaign, informed about the pandemic, and so forth. And we look to journalism to be informed. So when Keith and I were setting out to organize this event, we wanted to frame it through a particular question. And the question that we wrote was, and I have it here, what can we expect and what should we demand of journalism? And I think the question is ever more charged in a landscape dominated by social media, where information goes viral, where we're all living amidst a global pandemic, and then right here in the United States, where we have a president who routinely attacks the press. So those are just a few of the points up for discussion tonight. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists who've given their time to join us in this really important discussion. First we have, and I guess maybe you can turn on your video as I introduce you. We have Karen Attiah. Welcome, Karen. She is the Global Opinions Editor at the Washington Post, where she commissions and edits commentary on global issues from a variety of international writers. Karen often writes on issues relating to race, gender, and international politics, with a special interest in Africa. She was the winner of the 2019 George Polk Award, was the 2019 Journalist of the Year from the National Association of Black Journalists, and won the 2019 Harriet Beecher Stowe Freedom Writer Award. Thanks for being here, Karen. We have Courtney Radsch. She's the Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists. She serves as Chief Spokesperson on global press freedom issues for the organization and oversees CPJ's engagement with the United Nations, the Internet Governance Forum, and other multilateral institutions, as well as CPJ's campaigns on behalf of journalists killed and imprisoned for their work. As a veteran journalist, researcher, and free expression advocate, she frequently writes and speaks about the intersection of media, technology, and human rights. Her book, Cyber Activism and Citizen Journalism in Egypt, was published in 2016. Thanks for being here, Courtney. And Chip Somodevilla is a senior staff photographer for Getty Images based in Washington, D.C. He was named the National Press Photographers Association's 2019 Photographer of the Year. In 2016, Somodevilla was part of a team of Getty Images news photographers that were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize for Breaking News Photography. The White House News Photographers Association awarded him Photographer of the Year in 2010 and Political Photo of the Year in 2006. He focuses on US politics, extensively reporting on the presidential campaigns of John McCain, Mitt Romney, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and other candidates. Welcome, Chip. I'm going to be moderating for about 45 or 50 minutes. We have a Q&A, so if you have questions, please do place them into the Q&A. We'll do our best to field them live and fold them into the discussion, and any that we don't get to as the discussion is unfolding, we do have time, again, after this 45 or 50 minutes of the panel, and we will get to your questions then. So, all right, we're talking about a domestic issue. This is the US presidential election, but it's one that has global significance. So Karen, I'm gonna ask the first question of you. From your position as the global opinions editor, how is this election being framed from an international perspective? And are you thinking about this presidential election differently from prior elections?
Yeah, very, very, very good question, and one that we are grappling with, and I mean, in some ways, always grappling with this, and I'm sure maybe Courtney can attest that it can be difficult to get a spotlight on things that are in general happening outside of America. I think, so this is my second election cycle as a journalist with the Washington Post. And already, I mean, there's a difference in what we're seeing and interpreting as far as like the presidential election in a global context. 2016, we remember, was the year of Brexit, the year of sort of surprise votes and referendums like around the world. And the election of Trump was, I remember at the time with Global Opinions, there was a huge amount of global shock, perhaps, sort of confusion, and the sort of a lot of pieces sort of wither the United States as a global leader. And I think vice versa, domestically, there was an interest in pieces and points of view from outside. Americans wanted to know how we were looking as a country. So all to think about that as compared to now, and the reaction from the rest of the world is sort of like, you know, the US has lost it, or just familiarities, I think, in terms of the fragility of freedoms, the fragility of democracies, the authoritarianisms, attacks on the press. We've seen a lot of pieces and commentary, you know, almost like advice pieces from quote unquote other countries that, you know, rights and freedoms and values we tend to think are, oh, those are just, you know, routine goings-ons in other countries. And then to see the attacks on the press, to see the rollbacks of civil rights. You have a lot of commentary saying, hey, America, wow, we've been there. You're flirting with very, you know, dangerous forces. You know, I think now we're, as we saw before, the polarization of the media, the hyper partisanship, more and more about misinformation, disinformation, and the role of social media companies in keeping us in our bubbles. And I think that is a massive struggle. All that said, I think a lot about local media and the economic pressures and strains that local media, state media is still going through. I'm privileged to work with a place like the Washington Post, but I also realize that as newsrooms are shrinking, paring back, we're losing great sources of information and reporting at the grassroots on the state and the local level. So that's what would keep me up at night as a media watcher, is that these seismic shifts, these crazy consequential things are happening. Meanwhile, the layoffs are continuing, the consolidations are continuing. It is still a precarious position, or a precarious profession rather. So yeah, it's a time of reckoning in many ways, and I'm sure we'll get into it. But I feel this time it's America is becoming an island in many ways to itself, you know, and we haven't even talked about the pandemic. So long story short, it's a lot to deal with.
I think that was a fantastic response that talked through or touched on a whole bunch of topics that, just as you said, like, yes, let's like dig into all of these. And since you ended on the pandemic, I'll pick up from there. And, you know, so I pitched that question to you as like, yes, this is a domestic election, but it has a global significance. And maybe I'll kind of come back in and saying the pandemic is global, but its impact is enormous in many places, and especially here in the United States. I think today we had over 60,000 new cases. And of course, we're holding this event on Zoom because of the pandemic. So I want to think about how the pandemic is affecting election coverage, both in everyday practice, in how you're working and what you're seeing, and then also as a safety risk or a threat. So Chip, I think I'll start with you and have you talk to us or show us your images and talk to us about the role of the pandemic in this.
Sure, yeah. I'll start. I wanted to first show you two photographs. The first one was made in January of this year. And as you can see from the caption, it's an image of Joe Biden campaigning in Iowa. At the time, he was not, I don't think he was polling in the top 3 candidates at the time at the end of January, or he may have been 3rd. And he was not, it wasn't looking like he was going to win Iowa, and he was going to move through New Hampshire and then eventually head to South Carolina, where he hoped to make a big win. And but this was really an example of the way that Joe Biden campaigns and the way that he interacts with supporters and voters. He's a person who touches people, and he touches them emotionally, but he also touches them physically. He's very his interactions with people, as you see from the picture, are very intimate. And some of the supporters that came out to see him in Iowa had been supporters of his for decades. And so they had known him for decades, and he knew them all by first name and last name. And so people would come up and he would say, it's really, really good to see you, Dolly. How are you? And how's your husband? And he would give hugs, and he would lean in, and he would hold hands, and he would kiss people's hands, which is, I know it's a little unusual for candidates to do that today on the campaign trail, but it was not at all unusual for Joe Biden to interact with voters that way. And it made for great pictures. I mean, we could, as you could see from here, we could get within a few inches of Vice President Biden, make our photographs, talk to people, get their names, get an idea of their relationship. And that was really exciting. And I'm not kidding, I have stacks of pictures of Joe Biden hugging senior women. That was his favorite thing to do out there in Iowa and New Hampshire. And then the next frame is just 8 months later, and it's a picture of Biden at an event that I photographed last week. And as you can see, it's completely different. He's running a totally different kind of campaign due to the coronavirus. This is as close as he gets to voters and supporters now. He's 20 feet away, and this is the best that people can do as far as selfies and other kind of images that place them with the candidate. Biden is running an extremely safe campaign. He doesn't have more than, I would say, 10 or 15 guests at any given event, whether it's indoor or outdoors. The press has been pared down to a very small group of photographers, reporters, and pooled television. Each of us are tested for coronavirus every day when we are on the Biden campaign to make sure that we aren't a risk for the virus. And we fly normally at this point in a campaign, and I've covered pretty much all the major candidates since Obama-McCain in 2008. Normally, by this point in the campaign, the candidate has leased an airplane, and the journalists enter the bubble, this kind of space that we call the bubble around the candidate that's protected by the Secret Service. And we enter this bubble, and we're able to move quickly from place to place to place and maintain security. And now with Biden, we have 2, sometimes 3 airplanes that are flying in tandem from place to place, and the journalists are kept on a separate airplane. This also increases our inability to do a thorough job of covering the campaign. I say that as a kind of a comparative thing. I say thorough, I mean in ways that we've covered previous campaigns. And when that happens, it also it creates a few more barriers.
I think we might have just lost Chip. By way of explanation to the audience, Chip is zooming in from Nashville. He arrived the day before because he will be covering tomorrow night's debate. Chip, you cut out for a moment.
Sorry about that. I just turned off my video, so maybe that will help.
Yeah.
But as I was saying, with us not being able to have the same kind of access we've had previously with candidates, I think that's detrimental to us finding out more about the candidates. Fortunately for us as an electorate, Joe Biden and Donald Trump are well established. We know a lot about them already, and so that's good for voters. But also, not being able to cover the campaign the way that I think we should be covering it, it makes it really difficult.
Thank you for that, Chip, and for giving us your long perspective and having covered these campaigns in the past, and giving us the visuals to see this and how it's unfolding. I know your video is off now, but we saw you wearing a mask, right? You've got PPE. You mentioned getting tested very frequently. So there are these safety risks involved. And Courtney, I want to keep on the theme of the pandemic in terms of thinking about risks and safety and threats. I guess my question is, are there particular threats against journalism or journalists, either way, that have come up because of the pandemic? And then even beyond the pandemic, are you seeing risks or threats that are specific to the coverage of the US election?
Well, sadly, I could spend an hour talking about the threats that have arisen to press freedom because of the coronavirus pandemic, both in terms of the pandemic itself, creating new challenges for reporters who have to go out to report, whether they're even allowed to go out to report, because of quarantines, et cetera. Here in the United States, that's not an issue, but it has been an issue in other countries like India, South Africa, et cetera. The challenges of trying to do in-person interviews to try to document the historic protests that have been happening in the United States, as well as in Lebanon, in Belarus, in Hong Kong, et cetera. And the digital security challenges and risks that journalists who are increasingly forced to do all of their reporting using online tools or phones or other digital technologies that are susceptible to hacking and spyware face. But compounding that is the challenge and the threats posed by the responses to the pandemic in terms of the repression that we're seeing around the world. Here in the United States, where we are seeing restrictions on access to information, access to officials, access to the White House, to campaigns, et cetera. Where we're seeing in Puerto Rico, for example, the attempt to criminalize false news and impose fines for reporting on information that does not comport with the official version of events. In the United States, we have the First Amendment protections, but in Egypt, in Iraq, elsewhere around the world, in Venezuela, Ethiopia, we're seeing that false news laws are being deployed against journalists to restrict them reporting on coronavirus numbers, fatalities, infections, et cetera, under the auspices of, you're not reporting what the officials are saying. We're not quite to that extent here, but journalists are facing, I think, really compounded, unprecedented challenges just to do their ordinary job, because they have to take the precautions, the safety precautions, wear the PPE, the personal protective equipment, not only for the coronavirus, and we have a lot of information about that on our website at cpj.org, very useful tools for journalists who are going out, translated into more than 40 languages, updated on a pretty much bi-weekly basis as new information arises. We've also had to put out pretty unprecedented advice for journalists who are covering protests in the United States, and about the risks that they need to be aware of, hopefully in their risk assessment process. We want every journalist to be doing a risk assessment before they go out and report. And these include things like being aware that vehicular ramming is an issue during protests, being aware that law enforcement appears to be responsible for a majority of the aggressions against journalists during protests in the United States, according to our documentation with the US Press Freedom Tracker, which we helped found. The US Press Freedom Tracker, which we helped found with the Freedom of the Press Foundation back in 2017, has more than 900 reports that it is investigating of anti-press violence and aggressions during protests, mainly linked to the Black Lives Matter protests, and things like the anti-mask protests. So we're really, I think, shocked by what we're seeing here in the United States. We've been talking to foreign reporters who are talking about how they're having conversations with their editors and assignment editors about covering the United States the way that they would a foreign war zone, with domestic reporters based in the United States who are saying that they are taking the same type of precautions to cover the elections, to cover the protests and other issues here in the US that they would take if they were going to conflict zones. And I think that's really shocking, because here in the United States, we typically like to think of ourselves as somehow the city on a hill. We have the First Amendment, but when we actually think about what this translates to on the ground for reporters, we are seeing that, unfortunately, there is impunity for attacks on journalists, which has really risen significantly in the past several months. And we are concerned about what is happening around the election and the after election. We are continuing to provide guidance and advisories to journalists who are working on the ground, who are working in their newsrooms, how to keep themselves safe, how to prepare. Some of it is basic that we, any journalist should do for any assignment. Other advice is more specific to these issues. Again, like all of that is available on our website. But I think one thing that stands out is, in fact, elections are often times when we see journalists at particular danger. We actually did specific election-oriented work in India, in South Africa, in Nigeria, and at several other elections around the world. I personally never thought we'd see the time when we would have to do that in the United States, but we do, because it is a real challenge, as we've had this dual impact of the pandemic and protests and the challenges that poses to reporters. And especially, as Chip knows very well, as a photojournalist, some reporters, photojournalists specifically, have to be out covering things in person. You can't take a picture via Zoom.
Well said. So I'm going to, with the kind of staggering amount of protests we've seen in 2020, we've also seen the rise, or at least the outspokenness of groups that come out against the Black Lives Matter protesters. And some of them are white supremacist groups. So the question that I want to ask, Karen, maybe I'll pitch this to you. How should responsible media cover groups like them? So for instance, if we take a group like the Proud Boys, and the Southern Poverty Law Center has designated them a hate group, how do you cover them? On the one hand, they are showing up in critical spaces to influence politics. On the other hand, how much platform does responsible news media want to give to a hate group?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Actually, what I would do is I would take that question and kind of zoom it a little broader, which is, how should responsible media cover race and race relations in general? I think, 2020 has caught a lot of media organizations off guard. I think the Trump election has caught a lot of media organizations off guard when it comes to how to cover race as a force that has shaped this society, right? So, to zoom back out, white supremacist violence has always made covering race issues a serious threat to journalists. We can read back to the time of civil rights, and in the 1960s, Dorothy Gillum, the first Black female reporter at the Washington Post, writes about this in her book, Trailblazer, that going into the Deep South during that time was like a war assignment. Journalists, particularly Black journalists, were targeted, were threatened, had to be snuck in, and were even beaten so badly by crowds and protesters that she writes about how one of her colleagues ended up dying from his injuries. So this issue around race, white supremacy, and power has always been dangerous, and not just because of the KKK, not just because of the Proud Boys, and not just because of these, militia, domestic terror groups, I would call them, that are popping up. And going back to that term, domestic terror groups, I think what we're seeing now is media, at the very least, we're seeing challenges on the language that we're using to what to even call what we're looking at, right? And I think for a long time, Black journalists of color have long said that we need to call spades spade, call racism what it is, which is not necessarily a pejorative term that we're calling somebody mean or rude or bad, but we're describing the impacts of an action, of a policy, of an ideology, right? So I think the challenge for covering these sorts of groups is, as a Black journalist, I think that the challenge is how to do it in a responsible way that demonstrates an understanding of how white supremacy works, and also demonstrating that, you have to think through, what is the best way to handle a dangerous substance? And I think we've seen whether it has been profiles of white supremacists, is it a smart idea to just give them the mic to spew their hatred, which is a lot of times what they're looking for? I think media runs into a mistake in thinking that, well, the best way to cure what these groups stand for is to give it sunlight, is to let them speak, because surely it means that people will see what they're standing for is so silly and ridiculous. And I think that has been honestly a mistake. I think that media organizations should treat some of these figures, and there are times when maybe writing a straight op-ed that goes unchallenged isn't the best thing. Maybe it means putting those figures in context with other groups, a lot of backstory to push back, right? So I think we're beyond the time that looking at these groups as curious little spectacles from the past is frankly irresponsible. And I think now what people are calling for is to treat them like the violent threats that they are, and to handle them with the utmost care, and to always ask these questions: how does this serve the national dialogue, the national conversation? How does this push our understanding forward of who we are as a people, as opposed to let's platform these ugly, violent fascists for the sake of platform, you know what I mean? So I think that it's, again, writ large, it means that in general, we need to do better with covering race as a serious and, you know, it's not just the job of Black journalists to do that. It should be the job of every journalist to do that, white, Black, any race, any color.
Of every journalist. And then also I think the responsibility can fall to the news outlets as well, to have a kind of standard that upholds some of this. Courtney, I know you wanted to jump in with some thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think just to build on what Karen said and take it to the perspective that journalists who are reporting on white supremacy, on disinformation, and on these issues should also be aware that there are specific safety threats that also come with that. And, you know, chief among those is what we call online harassment, which is kind of a generic term for a whole series of different types of threats and attacks on journalists. And, you know, as I mean, Karen certainly, you know, can speak to and alluded to, is the role that the journalist's identity plays in that, you know, their gender, their race, their beat. We know that in some cases, you know, this is endemic to the beat. We've spoken with journalists who are covering these militant groups, the domestic terrorist groups, the white supremacy, who are covering disinformation, because there's of course a nexus between all of this. And, you know, they are facing real threats online that often translate offline. And of course, if you are in the field covering these groups as they are protesting or counter protesting, you know, it's really important that you're aware that it is a volatile and dangerous situation. And again, like going to this idea of risk assessment, what is the likely risks that are associated with the beat that you work on, with covering these really volatile and intense issues? So, you know, just to kind of add a little bit of that perspective to add on to what Karen was saying.
Yeah.
I mean, another thing with the attacks that we saw, that we've documented with the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker as well, you know, we saw that journalists who occupy minoritized identities, Hispanic journalists, Black journalists, seem to have been targeted. You know, you saw, for example, Oscar from CNN targeted a Hispanic journalist and his white colleague right down the road. Not, you know, we're still looking into what exactly the dynamics are, but it certainly does not look good.
Yeah, and if I could quickly jump into that, I mean, you know, even just personally, this has probably been the year where I've been the most worried for my safety, and Courtney will know, and some people may know, I had to deal with the Saudi Arabian government in advocating for Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was killed 2 years ago. And yes, like Courtney alluded to it, this term that we've sort of borrowed from real life, like sort of digital harassment, sexual harassment, because so much of our work and our lives are online, and because our real life, especially now in this pandemic, is digital life, I think of it as, it is digital intimidation and violence. It is coordinated campaigns to attack the reputations of Black, particularly Black women journalists. And I have seen just the vitriol and the threats like I've never seen before, right? And it's also, it is, you know, having to talk to friends from abroad, journalist friends from abroad, who are telling me that they're nervous for me and other Black people. You know, I think when I talk to my white colleagues, like, that is shocking. I can't believe that, you know, this country has come to this. And for many of us, we're like, this is what we've been dealing with, although not on this scale, but just to exist online invites scorn and violence, you know, in this country. So I think this is the country, this is America.
I mean, I know that the International Crisis Group, which is an independent non-governmental organization whose mission is to call attention ahead of conflicts and hotspots around the globe, just recently, for the first time, turned attention to the United States and election-related violence, which kind of brings this front and center. You know, the example of protesters and counter-protesters is just one way of thinking about how things in this country feel very, very divided right now. And so the way I want to ask this next question in terms of journalism is there one industry of journalism these days, or two, one for the left and one for the right? Because I think at times it feels like there's an almost an impossible divide, a chasm that's so great, but media isn't supposed to be just for the left or just for the right. So Chip, maybe I'll start with you. Do you think the chasm is too great for media to overcome, or can we reach both sides or all perspectives?
That's a really good question. I think that it depends on the medium also. With photojournalism, which is the sphere that I work in and move around in, I think that many of us as photographers are not always thinking about, well, we're primarily political photographers. I work on Capitol Hill and the White House. So we're not always thinking about Republican or Democrat or red or blue. We're there to intelligently and accurately cover what's happening in front of our cameras. So I think that the images that I ultimately make and that are provided to people to use for their publications, I hope that those images can never be considered bias, or that I could be described as a person who treats this political party a certain way and this political party another way. But I'm also in the bigger picture lumped in as a journalist with people who are on television networks who do have opinions and do have biases, and so that sometimes does make it difficult to work, because you'll approach a subject or a location or an event and people think that you already have an opinion, that you're prejudiced when you walk in. So yeah, the media landscape it's got a lot of different views from a lot of different perspectives, and it does make it difficult sometimes for us to take pictures out there. But I think that as far as the journalists that I work with on a daily basis, both reporters and producers, cameramen and photographers, I think that they do a pretty good job of trying to accurately and fairly capture what's going on in front of them. But beyond that, what happens in television studios in Atlanta or New York or Los Angeles or wherever, I like to think that we're different aspects of that, but a lot of people like to put us all in together. And you see that a lot of times at political rallies also, when a particular candidate or a speaker, someone turns and points a finger at the journalists and then says, you know, they're the enemy, then suddenly whether you like it or not, you're on the defensive.
And have you, or any of the three of you who wants to speak to this, experienced that personally? So, I mean, even just yesterday, thinking of rallies, Trump had choice words for CNN at his rally yesterday. And it was under the broader heading of his attacks on the press, which, you know, there's the attacks when someone stands up there and points a finger at the journalists, and all of a sudden you have an angry crowd facing the journalists. And then I'm also thinking about how should news media respond to Trump's consistent efforts to undermine the credibility of journalism for the American public. So Courtney, maybe that's a question you want to start with, about kind of Trump's attacks on the press, and then Karen or Chip, if you want to chime in as well.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the reasons that we started the US Press Freedom Tracker in 2017 is because in 2016, during the election cycle, we saw a rise in verbal attacks on the press and threats to, undermine the rights and basic, abilities of the press to operate freely. So what we saw, during that time, and of course in the subsequent years, is that when a political leader, especially the president of the United States, but really, anyone with a large following, attacks a journalist or a media outlet, that then leads to a dogpile effect that leads to more and more harassment and threats, etc. Again, especially if you have any sort of intersectional identity, if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, a journalist of color, you are probably going to face attacks. So, we started documenting that. And since then, we have seen a huge rise in the number of attacks on journalists that are not just verbal and not just online anymore. And I think, again, it's really important what Karen said, is that we call it online harassment, we call it online threats, but there is no difference between life online and offline. This is life in 2020, right? So, what we're seeing is that it is increasingly, dangerous for journalists. And you have to put that into the context where we see an increased militarization of the police, right? You've got all of this gear, training, equipment, veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, many of whom go into the police forces. This is having an impact on how, they're looking at the press and how they're seeing, the role of journalists during that. You've got increasing hostility from protesters who want to be portrayed in a certain light, and everyone thinking about who's going to win the visibility contest on social media, whose hashtag is going to get trending, which photo is going to become the iconic photo of whatever the incident is. So you've got a lot of really volatile, I think, situation here. And then you couple it in this increasingly, it is a very partisan divide. But I think the fact is that when you talk to most journalists, they are out there because they want to report on what is happening on the ground, to tell stories that aren't being told, to help hold those in power to account. And most journalists want to be balanced. But as myself, I worked as a journalist in the Middle East for an Arabic language news station owned by Saudi Arabia. Scary. We can get into that later. But what I learned in that experience compared to, say, working at the New York Times is, all the journalists are trying to be balanced, but your fulcrum on which you're balancing is informed by the perspective of who you believe your audience is, what you believe is the public interest. And so that's going to shift, how they cover something. So I think, the problem, one of the many problems facing us right now is the decimation of local news, which, could be a whole seminar in and of itself. But one of the byproducts of that is that a lot of people have never met a journalist. They don't know journalists. They don't necessarily have any experience in understanding what goes into journalism and how that's different than what they see from any random person on social media, or, the counterfeit news organizations that are posting content on these platforms, where news is indistinguishable from other forms of communication like commentary, propaganda, et cetera. So, we're in a really challenging environment kind of along all of these fronts. And now you've got, of course, this very, tense election period where obviously partisanship is going to be at the forefront. But, I don't think most foreign correspondents who are covering the US, they're not partisan. Local journalists are just trying to cover these issues, for their communities. And I think, again, a lot of people don't distinguish between, say, punditry and journalism.
Forgot to unmute. Karen or Chip, did either one of you want to add in on this broad heading of kind of attacks on the press? And then Courtney, of course, walked us through almost a media illiteracy, like a lack of understanding of what is journalism, how does it work? So any of those topics.
Yeah, I would say, I think that, I agree with Courtney that most journalists, whether it's local or national or international, trying to do our jobs sometimes necessarily entail the fact that the people who we're interviewing and that we talk to don't like us very much. Like, I think most people get into this profession not because they want to be popular, but because they believe in getting the truth, which can be a very unpopular thing to do in normal times. That said, I think, as I'm thinking about everything everybody has said, and I think the attacks on the press are also part and parcel of another trend in general, which has been happening in the US, and Trump has just accelerated this, which is an attack in general on facts and expertise. And, as we're talking about the threats that we're facing in this pandemic, just even thinking about the attacks on scientists, on experts, on Fauci, Dr. Fauci, the lone voice this whole time that has been trying to steer this country according to a rational public health response, has to have bodyguards now, has death threats now. We have, an administration, it's almost like journalists in some ways are the canaries in the coal mine for attacks on the truth in many other ways. So whether it's now scientific truth, we're seeing that the attacks on the truth about COVID is, you can't separate that from the fact that America now has one of the leading death counts in the US, in the world due to COVID. And I don't think you can separate that from the constant onslaught against not just journalists, but on any form of truth tellers, expertise, academics, scientists, doctors, many people who've been ignored, and people are losing their lives and their jobs, the economy over that. So it really is a life or death issue. And I think another thing I would love for even Chip to comment on this. I mean, one thing we haven't really mentioned is the tension that journalists have between, say, covering an administration that, attacks the press regularly, but at the same time, we need access to those politicians and to the very same, networks and that need that for a story, right? So I think it's also this tension of needing to also still maintain access, needing to, God forbid, not get kicked off the presidential plane or the campaign plane, and yet how do you do that and still cover it fairly also on behalf of the readers as well, who need to know truths that might be uncomfortable to the candidates that you need access to. So
Yeah, that's really well said, Karen.
If you want to speak to that one.
Yeah. Real quick, journalists were here long before Donald Trump, and I have strong faith that we'll be here no matter who the president is. Number one. Number two, on the 2016 campaign, myself and some of the photographers, we would enter some of these rallies, and it was ugly. I mean, even before anyone spoke, the crowd would lash at us with ugly words and threats and things like that. And I thought to myself, I've been in a lot of hostile environments. I've been to combat zones in Iraq. I was there in April of 2015. I was there when they put Freddie Gray in the ground. I was there for the protests and the violence afterward. I thought, this is a political rally. I can handle this. It's not a problem. But now things are different, and people are getting shot and killed. And we also need to remember, in talking about safety and security for journalists, the man who was shot and killed at a protest in Colorado was killed by a security guard that was hired by a journalist. So that's something to think about also. I mean, it's dangerous out there, and it's escalating. So whereas I used to think, oh, this is no problem, I can handle this, it's becoming a little bit more dangerous. My company has done a fabulous job. Getty Images has done a fabulous job of making sure that we have the resources and tools that we need to keep ourselves safe in the face of protest, in the face of violence, and in the face of coronavirus. So I'm so grateful to them for that. But if you'd asked me 5 years ago if we were going to have to be thinking about this, yeah, I would have told you there's no way that we would be having to deal with something like this. But as I said at the beginning of my remarks, we were here a long time ago, and we're going to be here for a long time to come.
I think what we're going to do now, since we're just coming up towards 8, is open up to Q&A, and I can see a few questions already populating. So let me go ahead and I'll read the questions, and whoever wants to field them, please feel free to unmic. First one reads, is part of the journalist's job to educate viewers about distinctions between virtual and actual events? I'm not, somebody want to take a stab at that? I'm not 100% exactly on the question. Maybe is the journalist supposed to be transparent in terms of whether what they're covering is happening in a virtual space or happening live on the ground?
Yeah, I don't know what they mean by virtual. I think that's before I go any further, I should know what that is.
Well, I'm going to let that person jump back in and rewrite the question. We'll come to the second one. How can reporters and publications avoid letting bad actors and the president flood the zone with shit, causing coverage to be swept up and diffused in the chaos? And I think another way of thinking about this is, how is the news curated? And is there too much focus on the spectacle and the sensation? And what about the other stories? Karen, you want to grab that one?
Sure. So, I mean, just to be very clear, so I sit on the opinion side of the Washington Post. I'm not on the news side and on the opinion side. And this has been a constant push and pull for 4 years when it comes to, I mean, it's always the question, this is always the question with bad actors and good actor. I mean, you have people who are wanting attention and wanting to draw the attention of the media, right? That being said, there were so many debates, especially early on, like, you know, okay, the president is up at 5 a.m. tweeting. Do we need to have 6 pieces on what the president tweeted this morning, especially when Fox News is going to pick up on the tweet? It will set the agenda for the entire day. And I think that's one thing that we had to realize, is that the president has been very good at agenda setting, honestly, just through a tweet. And so I think that in many ways, this is where it does come down to the organizations in our sections, and again, drawing on hopefully what is a diversity of content and coverage. Because honestly, and there was actually a pretty good article about this in the New York Times yesterday. Look, like we in this room, we're political junkies. We are tuned into the inner working, the inside baseball on so much that affects our political system. But there are so many people who might be tuning into like politics, like deeply, like in the last couple weeks. And just in general, it's just important to realize that there is more to our democracy than what's happening at the executive level. Like there's more to America and more to our democracy than Trump. So that's why it is so important for local news to be robust, because a lot of what capital D democracy is happening is in people being engaged at the local levels, whether that's in city government, community organizations, community boards, the activism that people care about. Like that's where politics, like in many ways, really is happening. So I think for us at the Post, like it's been a lot of like trying to pay attention to like the shifts and smaller stories in some ways that are happening around the world, around the country, and also around the world. I mean, just, you know, this week, Nigeria, you know, Africa's largest country, the giant of Africa, has been embroiled in massive protests against police brutality. This has been a long-standing issue, and for a long time I was worried that, you know, the world was distracted. The Trump administration thinks Africa is a country, honestly, as of last week, according to a statement by Pompeo. But to you know, have the resources and the bandwidth to be able to say like, all right, you know, we have to cover this. We can't, yes, the US election is 2 weeks away, but we are also have staff on board that recognize that this is something that, you know, we can't ignore and we would be judged for, I think, in the future, if we let, you know, if we let what's happening domestically drown out so much else of what's happening in the world. So I think we're actively always, I mean, it's still just doing our jobs, like keeping an eye on what's important. So yeah.
We have, under our broad discussion, which has circled around a decent amount of doom and gloom, we do have two kind of forward-looking and hopeful questions in the chat, and I'm going to put them together. They come from two separate audience members, but I'm going to fuse them together. The first is, how can we help restore the public's trust in journalism and journalists? And the second is, are there any innovations or changes in journalism that you're looking forward to? So if anyone wants to jump in on either or both of those questions.
I mean, I can jump in maybe a little bit, which is, I think one of the, you could call it an innovation journalism over the past couple of years, is this recognition that if journalists don't stand up for press freedom and stand up for what journalism is, especially in a democracy, you know, they can't necessarily count on others to do that for them. And so I think one of the innovations I've seen over the past couple of years is news outlets and journalists realizing that it's not being activist, or maybe it is being activist, to stand up for press freedom and the safety of journalists. So it's interesting because you've seen, for example, the Washington Post launch the Press Freedom Partnership, where it gives, you know, ad space for us to raise awareness about threats against journalists around the world, and specific cases of journalists who are under threat. We have seen the One Free Press list, which again highlights like 10 journalists who are under threat around the world, and all of these media organizations around the world publish that. I think that's pretty new. You also see solidarity measures like through innovative reporting projects where journalists band together to, say, investigate the murder of a journalist like Jamal Khashoggi or Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta. And I think you're seeing that increasingly on the ground as well. I mean, a lot of the advice that we're providing to journalists include, you know, if you're a freelancer or if you're, you know, a photojournalist, go out with a buddy, have somebody who can have your back. And Chip, you know, very interested to hear from you, but, you know, if you're a photojournalist and you're taking pictures, you're not aware of what's happening behind you. So you want to have somebody who's got your back, who's, you know, got that situational awareness going on. And so I think the solidarity in the journalistic community where, you know, there is still an effort to, you know, get things first, but there's a recognition that we will all do better if we work together. There's a several innovative projects where, you know, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, there's a project in California where a bunch of local news organizations got together to, I think, like look through police data to find trends, et cetera. So this issue of like solidarity and journalists working together, I think holds a lot of promise and is frankly an innovation in this domain. So I think we see more hope for that. And in terms of building trust, you know, bringing these national stories to the local level is really important, or just focusing on the local level. You know, when I worked as a journalist and did my doctoral research in Egypt, one of the things that struck me in studying the media system there was how focused on the national, you know, politics it was. It was all about Cairo, all about, you know, Hosni Mubarak at that time. I'm dating myself, but you know, that is a real detraction, because you see in many of these countries that have poor press freedom records is, you know, there's this overemphasis on the national level. So I think we increase trust by getting back to local journalism. We've got to find a way to fund it and support it, and opening up journalism. So in our own journalism at CPJ, you know, we're like a news wire reporting every day on attacks against the press around the world. It's a real uplifting read. But, you know, we say in all of our stories how we tried to contact the official or whoever for comment. We tried to get them on WhatsApp. We tried to get them on a comment. We asked them this many times, no one responded, or what they did respond with. So building that into the journalism, clarifying that anonymous sources are not anonymous to the journalist, they are anonymous to the reader, and why, that sort of thing. So opening up the process of journalism, this, putting the source materials online. I think all of this holds a lot of promise, both in terms of innovation and in terms of building trust.
Chip, did you want to add anything? So we have supporting local journalism, greater transparency on journalism. Anything else you would add?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to add real quick, and it is, I think this circles back to what Courtney was saying originally, and Karen also said, that the idea of local news, of small, medium, large newspapers covering our communities and our state. It's so citizens and residents at a local level, but also it did a great service to journalism overall. It was sort of its own extension of a graduate school or a PhD program for journalists. I started off in a small city at a small newspaper where I cut my teeth on all kinds of assignments and was held to standards by the people that I learned from in that newsroom and the newsroom beyond that, and beyond that to bigger and bigger and bigger newspapers, until finally I was more or less ready to be able to work as a wire photographer covering national stories. That kind of farm system is so crucial to journalism, in my opinion. It helps to have it gives a place for young journalists to work and to be accountable to an editor, to be accountable to a publisher, to be accountable to the very community that they're working in. You're not just writing a story and throwing it out there on Twitter in hopes that someone retweets it. Instead, you're writing a story about the people in your own community. You're writing about people who are your own neighbors. You're taking their photograph, and inevitably you take a photograph, you put something in the paper, that person is going to come back to you later and say, oh, I really liked that picture, or I really hated that picture. And to hear that was really important, I think, for my development as a journalist. It helped me it was very crystallized to understand why I was doing this and who I was doing it for. So small, medium, large newspapers and other news organizations across the country, decentralizing that news and taking our eyes for short periods of time, away from the big bright object in the sky and bringing it back into your neighborhood. I think it's crucial.
Building the local resonance and the relationships and the respect within a community. Karen.
Yeah, if I could quickly, because I see there's a whole lot of interesting questions. To go back to this idea of what innovations are exciting. I mean, this is actually not an innovation. It is an American tradition, but I think it is so important that journalists are advocating for themselves within their organizations. So watching these newsrooms, watching the unions, efforts for journalists to join guilds, to join unions, so that they can demand better conditions, better training, more diversity, equal pay, all of these things that help us do our jobs better, right? So I think one thing that is frightening is when you see organizations, especially some that are bought by VC folks who are not investing back into the journalists that often, as we've talked about, all hour, can be risking their sometimes very lives and their reputations for doing this work. So I think a trend to really watch is watching journalists in their own newsrooms, again, beginning to demand more from their newsrooms. And like back to this question of trust and how to build it. I think that, even on our side, like trust is always earned, and we should always be working to earn the trust of the people that we cover. So, I think this goes back to the question of newsroom diversity. I mean, newsrooms are still extraordinarily, especially at the national level, not diverse, and do not, after some almost 60 years after the Kerner Commission, have not diversified their ranks. And even in major metropolitan areas that have huge communities of color, huge Black populations, their newsrooms do not look like that. So, and I've been vocal on this, Black journalists have been vocal on this, Latino journalists all year, but part of, I actually hate the word diversity. I think it's more of a power sharing agreements or a culture of sharing power and access and influence is part of doing our jobs of accurately covering the communities that we're asking people to pay for, of serving the communities that are paying for what we do. So I think that the media still has a long way to go, on that front. There's plenty to be said for the moment that we're in with Donald Trump. Had there been better work done on race and diversity and inclusion and empowerment of different voices, maybe we would have looked different. Maybe things would have looked differently, and how we would have covered Trump would have been different. But I think that is a lesson. It should be a lesson in how are we are not, the media is not infallible, that there are issues within the industry that have just continued to self-perpetuate, right? So I think that there's still a lot to be done to really earn, I think, especially the respect and trust of people of color, marginalized communities in this country. But the struggle continues, the fight continues for that.
And hopefully getting better and better and better. We're almost at time. There are a bunch of questions still in the chat box. We won't get to all of them. A few of them do address questions of hostile environment training and mental health, which, as Courtney will back me up, that could be an entire session in and of itself. So I am just going to, for the people who are posting those questions, I'm going to now just list a few organizations. Top of the list, of course, Committee to Protect Journalists. You can go to their website and find information on this. You can also go to the Rory Peck Trust, to the ACOS Alliance, to RISC, R-I-S-C, and to the DART Center at Columbia University. And if I have a chance, I'll type those into the Q&A as well. But there's a ton of information out there. I saw at least one of the questions was framed in terms of freelance journalists, and some of the organizations that I just named are specifically geared toward freelancers. Since we're almost at time, let me end on a positive note, kind of playing and paying forward what you were just saying, Karen. Can each of you take a moment to highlight any outlets or individuals who you think are doing really great work right now covering the election? Whoever wants to start that.
Oh, well, I think in general, what's been an interesting, maybe I should have said this at the very beginning. What's been a really interesting feature of this year is that it's very interesting to see foreign journalists actually coming to the US and questioning our politicians like Trump in ways that are tough. I mean, I would shout out Mehdi Hasan, who now is at MSNBC, has a reputation. Comes from the UK, where there's a very tough tradition of grilling people who are in power. Mehdi Hasan, Jonathan Swan of Axios has also had some notable and again tough interviews with follow-ups and contextualization and coming into the interviews with just prepared to push back. So I've been really it's been intriguing to see again foreign journalists who are kind of coming to the US with slightly more aggressive styles of interrogating Trump.
Great. Chip, Courtney? Any individual or organization you want to highlight that's doing really good work right now?
Go ahead, Chip.
Oh, I think that there are lots of organizations that are doing great work. I think that it's really hard to do good work right now because of the pandemic and the limitations that it's putting on journalists, especially trying to cover the presidential election or any other election related story. I could, one young photographer whose work I've really enjoyed recently, Stephanie Reynolds. She's a freelancer. I'll put her name in the chat, and She's a freelance photographer working in Washington, D.C., who's done a really terrific job with all the coverage of the Ruth Bader Ginsburg and protests and politics. Really outstanding work. And yeah, I'll put a few more in the chat as well that I think would be good for people to follow on Instagram.
And Lauren, if you don't mind, just because we protect all journalists and we try not to get into, you know, opinions about who's doing good journalism or bad journalism, because every journalist deserves to be safe, can I just take a moment to let folks know, especially because of some of the things in the chat, we have a dedicated election safety page. It's press, I posted in the chat. You can follow the hashtag PressSafety2020 on Twitter, and then also find it on cpj.org. You can link to it from the front page. We have our coronavirus, you know, safety information there. And we have an Ask the Expert feature where you can put in questions and our safety experts will help answer your specific questions. We're doing workshops with journalists and news organizations across the United States and around the world, obviously in the US about the US election, but around the world on coronavirus. And so, you know, what we hope is that by providing these safety resources, by bringing to light the challenges that, you know, freelancers in particular are facing, or, you know, Black journalists or photojournalists, and shining the spotlight, that will help improve public trust, but also help them get the resources that they need. So I would just encourage folks to check out cpj.org. We post everything as well on Twitter, and let us know how we can help support you.
Great, thank you. Thank you to the panelists, Karen, Chip, Courtney. Really grateful that you committed some more time to Zoom. Thank you to everyone who joined and listened in and shared your questions. Thank you to the behind the scenes at NYU Gallatin who got this up and running, and thank you to the Gallatin Galleries for hosting this event. So I hope everyone has a good night. I hope everyone stays safe, and I hope everyone votes. Thanks, everyone.